Hello and welcome to the third in a series of videos for the course ASPB1105 in the academic year 2020-2021 for the module Human Rights and Human Security in the Arctic. As mentioned in an earlier video, making these backup videos just in case there should be technical difficulties during the actual lectures on the 17th, 18th and 19th of November. And of course, not everybody has the same learning style. So in order to be able to provide the materials also for more visual and auditory learners, I'm going to put up a couple of videos which might in total be a bit shorter than the whole lectures because we won't have time for discussions and so on. But the idea is that everybody has a chance to not just read all the material, the slides are already online Moodle, but also to listen to the presentations, to the lectures. In the third part, I want to talk about the rights of indigenous peoples and international human rights law in the Arctic. I already mentioned that the indigenous communities in the Arctic are a big part of the Arctic population. And there's a whole range of international treaties which regulate the rights of indigenous peoples. These norms are also relevant for the Arctic nations. In fact, a lot of the initiative for the development of many of these rules, they come from the Arctic. They come from reindeer herders in Finland, or fishers in Norway, and so on. And the Arctic nations have played and continue to play an important role in shaping international law in this regard. We're going to briefly look at a couple of international treaty norms and how they can be utilized to defend and protect rights of indigenous peoples across the Arctic. There's no universal definition of indigenous peoples, but there are a couple of characteristics which are also highlighted in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is one of the norms, one of the texts I urge you to read. There's a good definition by José Martínez Cobo, which I'm going to read to you, which is widely accepted as a decent definition of what are indigenous peoples from the perspective of international law. And I quote here: "Indigenous communities, peoples, and nations are those which, having a historic continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing in those territories or parts of them. They form at present non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identity as a basis of their continued existence as peoples, in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal systems." End of quote. And that's a very clear and comprehensive definition. And it already describes the situation that a lot of indigenous communities find themselves in today. Often, also in large parts of Sapmi, they're a minority in their own homelands today. There's a strong emphasis on collective attachment, as calls it, to a specific territory. There's a strong connection between the people and the land. The culture is often very much influenced by the relationship to the land, to traditional forms of livelihood, for example. One feature that indigenous communities, both in the Arctic and elsewhere, have in common is that they're often marginalized by the dominant society. And it's in this marginalization that we find the seeds, the origins for the struggle for indigenous rights. International indigenous rights law is a subset of international human rights law. It is specific insofar as it deals with issues which are relevant for indigenous peoples, but it's also general insofar as the origins can be traced back to, from a legal perspective, can be traced back to international human rights law, for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Originally, these indigenous communities were sovereign, and that's something that we still see in the legal discussions in a couple of countries, for example, in the US, both in cases when we had intercontinental colonialism, for example, Spanish Empire in what's now Latin America, or British colonies in North America, and so on, or the French or German, Portuguese colonies, but also in the case of what I would call nearby colonialism. For example, in Sapmi, we have the experience that people, newcomers, came from the south and moved further to the north and basically pushed back the indigenous communities. We have a similar historical situation in Russia, for example. In either case, we have colonial experiences. For a long time, the idea the international community had about indigenous communities was that it should be an attempt to integrate them into the mainstream society, into the dominant society. That is an attitude that's still reflected in ILO Convention 107, for example. Since then, since the middle of the 20th century, a lot has happened in the realm of international human rights in general, but also especially when it comes to indigenous rights. Today, indigenous peoples are actors in their own rights. They play a role in shaping international law. They play a role not just in institutions like the Arctic Council, but also at the United Nations, for example. And it's thanks to their input, thanks to their work, that we now have instruments like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of 2007, which codify the existing customary international law with regard to the rights of indigenous peoples. It's due to the activism of litigants from indigenous peoples that we have a lot of case law, for example, under Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Today, indigenous peoples really play an active role in shaping the laws which protect them internationally. This is a trend that started to a certain degree already during the League of Nations era, but not without success. It got much more traction in the 1960s when the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights were adopted. And in the following years and decades, we had a stronger movement towards self-determination. In the 1960s, we saw a lot of decolonization, a lot of African nations, for example, gained independence. And the idea that indigenous persons should be assimilated into the dominant society, that's slowly been given up, even though the remnants of that can still be seen, and the long-term effects are still visible and felt by a lot of indigenous families. For example, forced schooling in boarding schools in a couple of countries. In the 70s, 80s, from 73 until 82, there was a decade of action organized by the UN to combat racism and racial discrimination. Since 1982, the UN has a working group on indigenous populations, so indigenous peoples, and since 2005, even a permanent forum on indigenous issues. Indigenous issues have arrived at the UN. They have a place at the UN, just like many other issues that are being dealt with there. And that's important because they're in a legal framework which centers on states, which is about states, the member states of the UN. Their indigenous people have a place. They have a place where they're heard, where their voice is actually heard and taken into account. The permanent forum meets once a year, provides expert advice, for example, to the UN Human Rights Council, but also to other institutions and programs on the UN level. The idea is that the forum also coordinates, or at least promotes the coordination of indigenous issues at the UN across the different fields. It works through recommendations, so this is not necessarily legally binding, but these recommendations can become the starting point for future legal developments. The increasing role of indigenous peoples at the UN does not mean that they would have won back their sovereignty, but it has been recognized now for some time, at the very latest since the Western Sahara case in the 1970s, that indigenous peoples matter. International law for a long time had the concept of terra nullius. It has it to a certain degree. Terra nullius means that land which does not belong to anyone, which is not claimed by any state, can be taken by any state. Today there are very few examples for real terra nullius. The Halab Triangle, for example, that would be between Egypt and Sudan. That would be one example in that regard. But this is not even really terra nullius, but more lack of clarity regarding a border. Real terra nullius is really rare. There have been situations, for example, when borders were drawn and mistakes were made regarding the exact location of a border, that suddenly parts of the land were excluded, but it was basically an unintentional creation of terra nullius. Real terra nullius as a concept was applied to territories which were conquered, especially by Europeans, and the concept relied on the fact that the conquerors ignored the presence of people there. Since the Western Sahara case by the International Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice made it clear that the presence of indigenous peoples means that land is not terra nullius. It's not there to be taken by others. Rather, indigenous peoples matter. They also matter legally. Regardless of their form of organization, the mere fact that there is no state in the way we understand it in Europe or in the Western legal sense, that does not matter. That does not make a territory terra nullius. It's not up for grabs if there are people actually living there. That was an important step forward. Was later also recognized in domestic court decisions, especially in Australia. And it's recognized today that indigenous peoples do matter. They do have rights. They have the right to self-determination. If you look at the international covenants, you'll find right at the start rules on self-determination of peoples. And these rights, they also apply to indigenous peoples. Self-determination can happen within the framework of a nation state, so it does not necessarily require political independence. Self-determination is also contained as a right in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Article 1 of the Declaration is a norm that shouldn't be necessary, because it basically states that indigenous peoples have the right to the full enjoyment of all human rights. In an ideal system, it wouldn't be necessary to repeat this, but the drafters of the Declaration found it necessary because very often the rights of indigenous peoples are being violated. In particular in the context of discrimination, which is then covered in Article 2 of the Declaration. Self-determination is then covered in Article 3, and the rest of the Declaration deals with issues which are particularly relevant for the situation that a lot of indigenous peoples find themselves in. Participation rights, land rights especially, protection against assimilation, protection of the language. It's important for cultures to have access to or to be able to speak your own language. Indigenous cultures are often seen by outsiders as outdated, old-fashioned, something from the past, but that's not true. They're cultures in their own right. They might be different from the dominant culture one is personally used to, but they're not part of a museum. They're living cultures. They're cultures which are in development. That difference is important to recognize, because at the end of the day, it's the indigenous peoples themselves who decide about their culture, who decide about the fate of their own development. And that's what self-determination is really about. Not about an idealistic outsider's perspective or ideas which are put in from the outside with regard to how things might look like, what might be nice to have. Rather, self-determination really means taking people seriously. Now, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is not legally binding. If you look at the Charter of the United Nations, you'll notice that UN General Assembly resolutions are not binding. That's Article 13, Paragraph 1. So that's soft law. But this soft law can reflect customary international law, and that's what the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples does to a large degree, especially when it comes to the right to self-determination. The Declaration has been a long time in the making, to over 20 years from the first draft to the actual adoption. And today it is considered to be the standard, the summary, so to say, of international indigenous rights law. Or, as it's called in the preamble, a standard of achievement. So this is basically where we stand right now. Keep in mind here that especially the right to self-determination is a right that has to be protected. It has to be taken seriously. This is a right that can be found in the UN Charter, in the international covenants, in a number of instruments from the 1960s, for example, but also on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Self-determination, and that's also in the Declaration, does not mean a right to secession. The existing customary international law regarding the question when a territory can secede from a state unilaterally has already been summarized in a number of cases, for example, by the ICJ in the Kosovo case, or most famously by the Supreme Court of Canada, a case called Referendary Secession of Quebec. The Quebec case is certainly one I recommend that you have a look at. No, it's a national case, but it sums up very nicely the current legal situation. It's still the relevant situation legally. Self-determination, therefore, does not necessarily mean independence. There can be an internal right to self-determination. In some cases, this can lead to autonomy. For example, in Finland, we have the autonomous Åland Islands, but does not have to go that far. It's important that the own political, social, cultural life of indigenous peoples is protected, but that they also get to participate in the life of the state in this regard, that they're not discriminated against. The right to self-determination also means that people decide freely how they want to pursue their own development, including in economic terms. In the Arctic, we often encounter land use problems, land use conflicts between indigenous and non-indigenous actors. This is a situation which is very similar in other parts of the world as well. Article 32, Paragraph 2 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples imposes a duty of states to consult with indigenous people. So there's a concept called the Free, Prior and Informed Consent, FPIC. And this requires the state to take into account the views and needs of indigenous peoples in decision-making processes which affect them. We have this to a certain degree also in domestic law in Finland. For example, in the Mining Act, there are a number of rules which allow, or which rather require, the state to take into account the views of indigenous representatives, for example, the Sami parliament. The idea is that indigenous peoples have the right to own their land, to develop it. That's in Article 26 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Across the Arctic, this right is not yet fully realized. Especially real private law ownership of the indigenous homelands is often not a reality. In many cases in the Arctic, we have less permanent forms of land use, for example, reindeer herding, fishing, where you don't need to occupy the land all the time in order to use it. These traditional forms of land use, they're in conflict with other forms of land use, for example, agriculture, infrastructure construction, tourism, mining, so on, which are more invasive, which require more. If you build a road, you cannot use the same spot of land for grazing reindeer, for example. So with new forms of land use, we have this idea of exclusivity, that suddenly there are forms of land use which are incompatible with other forms of land use. These land use conflicts have to be resolved. In many Arctic countries, the state holds ownership over large territories. We see this in Finland, for example, where large parts of the land are also owned by the Metsähallitus, the forestry administration, which is an outsourced entity. The idea contained in documents like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is that in principle there should be ownership rights, but there should also be usage rights. So the traditional ways to use these lands, even if there's not full civil ownership, these usage methods, they should still be possible. In Finland, we have this, for example, and also in Norway and Sweden, we have this, the organization of reindeer herding, for example, that there are specific rules how reindeer herding is organized, and which include access to lands where reindeer are basically free to walk, free to graze, and so on, without necessarily having civil ownership. What's important is that often we have very conflicting legal attitudes, legal approaches. And international indigenous rights law tries to bring these approaches together. If you look, for example, at the situation in Greenland, there's the idea that the land belongs to everyone. And if you build a house, you don't own the land on which your house stands, because the land belongs to everyone. We have similarly in Finland, Norway, and Sweden, everyone's right, the right that you have access to a lot of land for the purpose of crossing it, and for a limited number of other purposes, while being respectful of the rights of the actual landowners. These different legal attitudes, legal cultures in a sense, have to be brought together. And one tool that has been developed for this purpose is the idea of free, prior, and informed consent. The term consent here is a bit misleading because it does not give indigenous peoples a veto right, but it requires them to be heard. It requires the state to listen to indigenous peoples. This is still a bit less than what's required in Article 26 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, where there's specific reference to, and I quote here, the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. That's Article 26, Paragraph 2 of the UNDRIP. This is with regard to the land currently owned by indigenous peoples. If you look at paragraph 1 of the same norm, there it says there's a right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, and so on. Here we don't have a right to ownership. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples does not restore original ownership from pre-colonial times to indigenous people. That's important to keep in mind, that rights here are limited. Indigenous rights law is often also an attempt to correct injustices which have been committed in the past, but it only goes to a certain way, to a certain point. This is not unlimited. There is no real compensation for the injustices of the past offered by current international indigenous rights law. Insofar, it's also important to manage expectations somewhat. But what is relevant today is the obligation of the state to hear and to take into account indigenous peoples before taking measures which will affect them. And that's something you find in Article 19 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, where it says, quote, "States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them." End of quote. So if a state enacts a new law or takes administrative decisions, for example, issuing a mining permit, there has to be a process in place to listen to the views and needs of the indigenous peoples. Now, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it depends, of course, on the goodwill of states. International law in general has a major problem when it comes to enforcement. Especially in the human rights sector, we often rely on states, on the goodwill of states, to enforce these norms. A number of countries already have accepted, or rather courts in a number of countries already have used the norms of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as reflections of the existing customary international law for the purpose of determining rights and obligations also under domestic law. But the role of the state is undeniable here. Without the goodwill and the cooperation of the state, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples will remain a relatively weak instrument. What is a much stronger instrument are international treaties. Treaties are legally binding, and the most important treaty concerning the rights of indigenous peoples is ILO Convention 169. The International Labour Organization, the ILO, has long played an important role in protecting human rights, including indigenous rights. In 1989, the ILO Convention number 169 was concluded, which to this day remains the most important international treaty concerning the rights of indigenous peoples. I already had mentioned ILO Convention 107 from the 1950s earlier, which was still about adaptation, assimilation of indigenous peoples into the dominant societies. ILO Convention 169 gives up this idea. The convention is now much more about rights. It has become really a human rights instrument. Now, one reason why the whole ILO approach to human rights law might be less known is the relatively complicated enforcement mechanism. Under a treaty like the European Convention on Human Rights, for example, we have the possibility to submit individual complaints to the European Court of Human Rights. We have similar systems in the Americas and Africa. This is a system which, for lawyers, is intuitive. Basically, you have a complaint, you go to a court. The mechanism under the ILO conventions, including ILO Convention 169, is different insofar as it's based on the constitution of the International Labour Organization. Most importantly, the complaints are Article 24. these complaints require labor unions to get involved. So the ILO is based on the idea that's about protecting the rights of workers. And that is how the ILO got into the whole business of indigenous rights law in the first place. Because ILO Convention 107 was an attempt to bring indigenous persons into the workforce, into the labor market, and to assimilate them, make sure they get access to jobs and so on. ILO 169 is important because it goes beyond this. Nevertheless, the enforcement framework is the same. So you would have a labor union to basically take up the case and have it resolved through the entire ILO mechanism. There are a number of important cases, and in the slides you're going to see some of them, which have been resolved through this mechanism. The problem is that this is more complicated, even though it has worked reasonably well in the Latin American context. From a European and Arctic perspective, however, the big problem is that almost no states in the region have ratified the convention. Here it's Denmark with regard to Greenland and Norway, but Sweden and Finland, for example, have not even ratified this convention. In Finland, we've discussed whether the convention should be ratified or not for decades. So this has been a discussion that has been going on for quite some time, and different national governments here in Finland have also come up with different approaches, but so far it has not yet been ratified. Elsewhere, ILO Convention 169 has had a significant impact. For example, in Colombia, national law was repealed because of violation of ILO Convention 169. These cases are resolved through tripartite commissions. They tend to emphasize consultation more. So this is less of a court-like process, but more formed to aiming to solve problems. In Latin America, this has had a positive impact. There have been a number of cases with regard to Denmark, with regard to the Thule case, in which you can also find a bit more information within the slides. If we have the time, we might turn this into a bit of a group exercise during the actual live lecture. We'll have to see how much time we have with the discussions there. What is important is that this is a legally binding document, an international treaty which not only allows for complaints by individuals, but if one state violates the treaty, it also violates it with regard to all the other states. That's why, in theory, there could even be interstate cases, which are fairly rare. What ILO Convention 169 does not do is to protect the right to self-determination. The focus is much more on good faith negotiations. But this is hardly surprising because this was drafted in the 1980s. Today, the customary international law, which is reflected in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and which has evolved even since then, this is much farther than the ILO Convention 169. On a positive note, a number of the issues which are covered by ILO Convention 169, they cannot necessarily be raised under other international rights treaties. For example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has long been the starting point for litigation, for human rights litigation concerning the rights of indigenous peoples, especially Article 27. Article 27 includes a right with specific obligations for states, cultural rights, and the protection of cultural language, and so on. It protects minorities, and that makes it necessary for us to make a distinction here between indigenous peoples and other forms of minorities. Often you'll find in literature a distinction between minority rights and indigenous rights, because minority rights can also refer to, usually refer to so-called national minorities. For example, the Swedish-speaking minority in Finland. While indigenous rights refer to indigenous people, so that's a bit more specific. Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it covers both scenarios, both types of groups. Article 1 of the ICCPR, as already mentioned, covers the right to self-determination. Often, Article 1 has been used to interpret Article 27, especially when it's about indigenous communities, indigenous peoples. There is a wide range of cases dealing with Article 27. For example, in Finland, a number of cases regarding land ownership, land use conflicts, and so on. But also questions regarding who even is a member of a minority. In Finland, Norway, and Sweden, for example, we have different definitions imposed by the nation states as to who is a member of the Sami people. In one of the early cases regarding Article 27, the Loveless case, Loveless versus Canada, the Human Rights Committee dealt with this question: who is a member of a minority, of an indigenous group? In recent years, the emphasis has often been on land use rights, land use conflicts, be it fishing rights or conflicts with extractive industries. What these cases have in common is that there's often this idea that if one right is exercised, another right becomes totally impossible. When you look at different land uses, to take a classical example, reindeer herding versus mining, if you engage in mining, you cannot use the land for reindeer herding anymore. These cases are difficult because there is a significant problem with regard to balancing these competing rights. This is something that can be very hard to find a compromise. What the Human Rights Committee has done is to allow cases where there was a limited infringement, but to make it clear that if a traditional form of land use by an indigenous people is totally impossible, that then there would be a violation. And that's something you see in a large number of cases by the HRC in the context of Article 27 ICCPR. From a political perspective, it often also has to be taken into account that often these land uses are important in economic terms, in terms of tax revenue. If you look, for example, at the situation in the Russian Federation, where there's a lot of emphasis on extractive industries in the Arctic, which plays a big role for the national economy, or also when you look at Norway with regard to oil and gas, or Sweden with regard to iron ore. These forms of income are important on a national scale. Hence, from a political perspective, it's often difficult to argue in favor of indigenous rights. And that's why these international treaties are so important. Not to have one form of land use always prevail over the other, but to have clear rules according to which such decisions are made. Another challenge faced by many indigenous peoples is discrimination. Discrimination is an ongoing issue in many settings involving indigenous communities. And the Convention on the Elimination of all Forms of Racial Discrimination is an important tool, for example, when it comes to fight discrimination based on language, on ethnicity, and so on. Discrimination against indigenous peoples is entirely covered by that, and there's been a number of cases, especially from countries which don't have regional human rights systems, like the European Convention on Human Rights, for example, especially from countries like Australia, for example. There have been a number of cases on CRD issues in the context of indigenous rights. The same can be said, for example, with regard to the US. Some of these cases, for example, the Western Shoshone case in the US, about which you'll find more information in the slides, they also concern land rights and questions with regard to the enjoyment of ancestral lands. Often the fact that land is not owned in a civil law sense by indigenous communities anymore, that leads to legal conflicts. So that's all of a sudden behaviors which were legal, or which were normal rather, for many generations suddenly become illegal. Think of fishing or hunting, for example. We had a similar case here in northern Finland in that regard. And discrimination can also happen by merely applying the law without distinction. Discrimination can happen, for example, by requiring somebody whose community, whose people have long used a resource, land or river, to require somebody to go through an additional process, requesting a fishing permit, for example, things like that. The regional human rights systems, on the other hand, they've often been the most court-like fora for the protection of indigenous rights. This is especially visible in the inter-American human rights system. A lot of the key case law of modern international indigenous rights law comes from Latin America, comes from the Americas. The Sarayaku case versus Ecuador, Saramaka versus Suriname. There are a number of safeguards in the inter-American human rights system which protect the rights of indigenous peoples. In the slides, I've put up a number of names of cases that you might want to have a look at when you want to delve more closely into international indigenous rights law. The case law from the Americas is substantial and important also for the development of international indigenous rights law on a global scale. One key concept here is not just self-determination, but what's called vida digna. Vida digna, the dignified life, is a key concept in indigenous rights law in the Americas. And it's not that far from concepts that we have in Europe, for example. We have the idea of human dignity, which is the underlying concept for legal instruments like the European Convention on Human Rights. And we have the idea that this is something which translates into concrete obligations. So this is no longer just an abstract concept, vida digna, dignified life, but it's a concept which has to have meaning, which in the case law of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights becomes relevant on the local level. And the question is then asked, what is necessary for a dignified life? In the context of indigenous rights law, this involves, for example, culture, the possibility to live with a certain degree of cultural integrity. It can involve self-determination, the ability to make decisions for a community. This is something we can see time and again in the case law of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. which is not standing alone, but rather which is rather part of international indigenous rights law as a whole. Most importantly, in last years, the emphasis has been on the duty to engage in consultations and the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. Procedural aspects, such as consulting with indigenous peoples, can be a tool to secure the dignified life that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights calls for. Here, we can then see in the case law of the court, the Inter-American Court, how a rather abstract concept, dignified life, comes together and is realized in practice on the local level through the effective implementation of administrative law rules. And that brings us to a core idea in international human rights law. International human rights law might get most of its attention when it comes to international cases, when it comes to judgments from international courts. But in everyday practice, it is realized on the local level. It's realized by people in public administration on the local or regional level, for example. It's realized by lawyers, by activists, by judges, by administrators. International indigenous rights law shows this very well, that the international requires the local level to be effective. Today, we are no longer just looking at indigenous rights only from one perspective, land rights, for example, or land use conflicts, but rather we try to have a holistic view, taking into account the needs of people and what is necessary for a dignified life. And that's what Arctic law, in my opinion, is all about. International Arctic law and Arctic governance is not just an abstract set of norms. It's not just about the environment or climate change, but it's a set of norms which is meant to serve the people who actually live in the Arctic and giving people living in the Arctic a chance to participate in the decision-making with regard to the activities and decisions which affect them. This covers not just land use issues, but issues such as the language of instruction in schools, for example. Do you get to have a school nearby where kids are taught in your indigenous language? Things like that. Today, we have a number of challenges across the Arctic when it comes to the rights of indigenous peoples. Many of them are related to classical problems of indigenous rights law, land use conflicts, discrimination, and so on. The courts play an important role. One of them is also the European Court of Human Rights. When the European Convention on Human Rights was created in the late 40s, indigenous rights did not play a role at all. In fact, that's something that seems to have been completely overlooked. But there have been cases brought by indigenous litigants to the European Court of Human Rights, and the court on a few occasions dealt with indigenous issues. And it's clear that the full set of norms also applies to indigenous people. There's no question about that today. Traditional activities, such as reindeer herding and fishing, can, for example, be covered under Article 8 of the European Convention on the Right to Private Life. In some cases, even procedural issues, for example, if you have to prove traditional land use for many generations, for which, of course, no paperwork ever existed, they've been considered. Today, indigenous rights law is not just a political issue, but fully part of international human rights law. And international human rights litigation options can be and frequently are used by indigenous applicants to defend their rights, But at the end of the day, it comes down to the nation states and to the practical realization of indigenous rights on the local and the regional levels. I think I already mentioned earlier that the two main challenges in the Arctic today are globalization and climate change. And it's these two challenges, which some can also perceive as opportunities, which are also most relevant in the context of indigenous rights, because they enable activities such as extractive industries, which in turn can provide challenges to indigenous rights. In some cases, this have translated into economic opportunities. For example, in Canada, there have been cases when, or in Alaska, when indigenous communities cooperate with extractive industry corporations for the purpose of securing the economic future of their communities. It can also be a major challenge if environmental pollution and degradation make traditional ways of life impossible. At the end of the day, the right to self-determination means that it's up to indigenous peoples to make these decisions and not to anybody else. When decisions are made on the outside, by national governments, for example, then indigenous peoples must be given a role in these processes. They must be heard. And that's what the concept of free, prior, and informed consent is for. Indigenous rights are not a merely political issue, but they're really legal rights in the proper sense of the term. And that's important to keep in mind. In this particular field of law, it's often easy to forget that there's a distinction between law and politics. But today, indigenous rights law is firmly grounded in international human rights law. It has long been connected to key human rights documents like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it is this historic experience of a lot of human rights litigation which makes it clear that we're really talking about legal rights here, not just about policies or political decisions. In particular, the rights which are codified in international treaties and those rights which are part of customary international law. They're not up for political debate. Rather, they're true human rights which have to be respected by everyone. In the Arctic, this is not without challenges. Not even in the Nordic countries, which put a lot of emphasis on respect for human rights. This is not a finished chapter. It's an ongoing process. And it's part of the protection or the steady and the permanent aim to protect human rights in the Arctic more and more. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And this was the third backup video for the lectures in November.